Creating a rich game world for your players to explore is something a lot of game masters aspire to. I know I certainly do. There's something about making an engaging world and seeing your players get interested in that world. Seeing their investment is honestly one of my favorite rewards I get for running games. I love seeing what actions they want to take in the world, but in order to inspire them to take action, we have to present a world that has some detail and vividness to it. For a lot of game masters, this means creating some background information for your game, the world lore or the history of your campaign. Dungeons and Dragons is a game about exploring ancient and past ruins, going looking for treasures from civilizations long past. So naturally, if we want to have a detailed world for our players, that means giving history to those past civilizations that your party is trying to explore and uncover their prized possessions. Formulating these histories can feel like a daunting task. I think a lot of game masters fall into the trap of thinking they need this super deep lore from which they can draw upon. And it makes sense, right? We want to make our worlds feel epic. These civilizations have magics and powers lost to time, things that are not usually seen in the current age that the player characters find themselves in. I think this line of thinking leads game masters down a path where they are making a lot of history and depth because they feel that they need it to run their games. And this leads to an even bigger problem. Once the game master has made all of this history, they want to share it with their players. All of it. And that often leads to exposition and the dreaded lore dumps that leave players bored and sometimes more confused than when they began. It can be easy to lose sight of the fact that your D&D game isn't about these past civilizations. It's about the players and what they're doing right now. I think there's a simpler way to add this depth to your world. It not only reduces your prep and world building time, which is great, but if your players take interest in pieces of lore that you do share, well, then this established framework allows you to easily build out those parts further as your players plan to explore them, and still keeps that kind of cohesion within your history and lore that you've already established. Hi, welcome back aboard the Earthmote. I'm Randall, and today we're talking about how to add history and depth to your world without writing and sharing a novel with your players. The first step in making history for our campaign is to decide what is the necessary scope of it. The lore that you need for a one-off dungeon is going to be a lot smaller than the history for a civilization that has multiple ruins your players can explore within a region. If your lore is contained to a single dungeon, then you just need to get that lore to mesh with some of the different themes or ideas you're trying to present within that location. If you have the dungeon of a mad illusionist, well, then you probably want to design some illusory elements or magics within that dungeon. And then you want to tie those elements into explain who the illusionist was, what they were doing in that location, things like that. If your history is spanning your campaign region, then you'll need to know who those people were at a basic level. What made them interesting and powerful? What was the reason for their demise? What themes or ideas do you want to tie into that civilization, and how can you represent those ideas in your dungeons? Kevin Crawford has an excellent framework for making these histories. He talks about how you can focus on the 4 stages of a civilization: their origin, their rise, their peak, and their fall. In a lot of cases, you don't even need to focus on all 4 of those. You may only need one aspect that associates with the history that you're trying to convey in a single location. Unsurprisingly, Kevin Crawford has excellent tools in Worlds Without Number to roll up these histories and flesh out the different 4 stages of civilization that he talks about. I really like using these tools as my starting point. They really give me that basic outline of a history, and I can kind of tailor it as I sort of have the ideas in my mind and based off the random results that I've rolled up. In most cases, that outline is good enough to add the different historical elements that you want to add within your dungeon or your locations. But if you need to flesh it out further, just kind of continue to think or riff off the different ideas that you've rolled up, or roll up some more to give yourself some further inspiration. Let's go ahead and walk through an example using Kevin Crawford's tools from Worlds Without Number. I'm going to roll up some elements of the history off screen, and then we will go ahead and go through those random results, and I'll share my initial ideas and thoughts on what I'm seeing in the results. Okay, going through the rolls, first we have how did they originate? And I rolled up they were exiles or losers of some sort of civil strife. The next question is what became of the original inhabitants? So I take this to be the people that were in the area before these exiles showed up. And I rolled up they became the ruling class. So what was the historical crises that these people were faced with? I rolled up tyrannical rule. That makes sense with people were exiles or losers of a civil strife. How did they overcome that crisis? I rolled up skillful use of magic resolved the problem. What was great about the civilization's peak? I rolled its culture was compelling to its neighbors. And then next, why did it fail at the final crisis? Its neighbors conspired to help ruin it. So that's very interesting. First, its culture is compelling to its neighbors, and then they're conspiring against them. And then lastly, what became of the unabsorbed survivors of the region? And I rolled up, they degenerated into savage remnants. Okay, these are pretty interesting results. So what I'm seeing is that a group of people fled their homelands due to a civil war or oppression, that tyrannical rule that we rolled up. And when they find what they believe to be a new land, they encounter some inhabitants that are already living in that area. Now, based on our rolls, we see that these original inhabitants actually were powerful enough to become the ruling class over these refugees. So looking at our other results, we had this historical crises, this sort of tyrannical oppression that they faced. That kind of fits in with what made them leave the homeland. They were able to rid themselves of that tyrannical rule through the use of magic. So to me, that says maybe they encountered these powerful sorcerers or priests in this new land that agreed to help these refugees out in exchange for being kind of elevated in their society, aka becoming the ruling class. Out of options, these refugees accept the terms and they're able to defeat the tyrant. We may have to at some point decide if they killed the tyrant or if they were just able to escape his grasp for good. But for now, we don't really need to answer that question. As this new kingdom grew, they were an inspiration to their neighbors. Perhaps these sorcerer kings were using their magic to make their nation prosperous and plentiful, and as a result, their neighbors wanted to trade with this kingdom. But of course, over time, these sorcerer kings grew decadent with their amassing hordes of wealth from all this trade, and they became complacent and neglectful, leaving this opening for their neighbors that once valued their friendly nature, but now grew resentful or jealous of all that this kingdom has. Perhaps over time, the conspirators were able to compile enough of their own arcane knowledge and power, and they were able to release this dreadful curse on this kingdom and its sorcerer kings. Those that weren't outright defeated by this curse became these twisted and wicked shells of their former selves. Now what's left of these people haunt the ruins and dungeons of their homeland. Despite them being cursed and warped, some can still wield these powerful sorceries that their ancestors once possessed and used to make their nation great. So there you go. Now we have something that we can focus on and refine that outline to make these interesting and compelling themes and ideas that will ultimately generate these good adventure seeds and conflicts for the players to explore throughout the world. As you work on your campaign world and continue to add in new locations that were used historically by a civilization you've already created, then you can add in relevant content to that dungeon based on the outline you've built and add any sort of expansionary works that you need as you deem necessary as you continue to build out your dungeons that are tied into this specific civilization. This way you are organically growing the lore you need on an as-needed basis. It's going to really help you keep down that front-loaded prep work for running your games. You can help organically grow my channel by hitting the like button and consider subscribing if you're enjoying this video and you'd like to see more content like this in the future. When it comes to showing your players the lore in your world, I think less is more. I like to think about it as a movie trailer. Your lore sharing should be showing these snippets and teasers of a greater tale or conflict at work. Remember, if you're sharing lore of an ancient world, it's unlikely that they're able to find a complete picture of what actually happened. Historians, archaeologists, and anthropologists in real life spend countless years of meticulous study and research to try to understand these historical civilizations of our past. Your players on a single stroll through a dungeon aren't likely to do much better than that. Now, there is an important distinction in this analogy, however. I think that in our games, we do want to share these juicy and interesting pieces of information with our players. We do want to give them further reasons to explore, so try to give them those interesting pieces of the information of what has happened historically, even if it's not the full picture. So what you're packaging and sharing with them is going to be a lot more actionable than what an archaeologist might ever find at a dig site. So just keep that in mind as you're kind of designing what pieces you want to actually show to your players. With our eye on our movie trailer analogy, it's clear that lore dumping isn't the answer. Exposition will likely kill the momentum at your table. Your mileage will vary depending on your group, of course. You know them better than I do, but unless there's something immediately actionable or tangible for your players, it's probably not that useful to them. If you're a world builder and you like building out those detailed histories for your game worlds, there's nothing wrong with that, but we do need to distill down the essence of that information into bite-sized chunks for our players to be most effective. Let's take a look at an example based on that civilization I rolled up earlier. I've written up a standard lore paragraph that a world builder might write up, but is probably kind of boring and ineffective to share with a group. So hopefully I don't lose you in the next 30 seconds while I read through it. The Tankari kingdom was brought low in the 8th century of the Age of Myths. Sorcerer King Haleth's decadent reign expanded the harsh tariffs on their trading partners. On top of Tankari's corrupt bureaucracy, the trade routes that were once prosperous between the states were now lopsided and heavy-handed by the great sorcerer nation. Tankari's neighbors harbored resentment and jealousy of the nation's great wealth and resources in thanks to their arcane power. The Gendash, the Siglani, and the Krenda nations weaved the Black Curse against Tankari using the eldritch grimoires of Guthrod. The Black Curse was swift, destroying all of those with no magical essence. Those with the arcane gift were twisted and malformed. Their agonies on full display, the dark sorceries of Guthrod stripped them of their sanity and transformed them into mocking shells of their former humanity. Okay, hopefully your eyes didn't glaze over too badly there. There's a lot going on here, but I think we can distill it down into some stuff that's actually actionable and interesting for our players. The main juicy bit here to me is the weaving of the Black Curse. This curse destroyed the civilization, so it's definitely kind of the crux of this lore dump. It has the most interesting element the PCs might care about, the eldritch grimoires of Guthrod. Maybe they've been tasked with finding them, or maybe it's the first time the PCs have ever heard of it, but it seems like this is some sort of dark magic, but it's also quite powerful if it could wipe out a whole civilization. If I had to choose a second most important element here, it would be the nature of the curse. It twisted the magic users of Tankari. They are now these monstrous cursed beings. Perhaps some of them still inhabit the ruins and the dungeons that the players are exploring. This might be useful information for the players to know that they are up against these monstrous spellcasters. These distilled pieces are much more focused. They have the most value to your players and they aren't really bogged down with the details. We don't need to worry about the rest of it for now, unless our players really care about it and are trying to learn more about the Tankari nation. Once we have the essence of that lore chunk we are wishing to convey, we need to figure out the best way on how to share that with the players. So we've talked about keeping your lore compact so that we can share it easily. Now we can talk about how you should deliver that information to your players. I've already stated that exposition is probably going to kill your momentum at the game table. So what can we do instead? In this case, we should heed the advice of writers. Show, don't tell. There are two main ways I like to think about it, so let's go ahead and go through each of them. Fragmented history is exactly what it sounds like. You are sharing small pieces of information with the players. They're not getting the full picture of your lore, but they're getting the key and actionable elements as they explore your locations and dungeons. These can be things like statues, murals, or frescoes that tell a story, or it could be treasure or magical items that are both useful to the party, but also something that tell the story or history of your dungeon or world. Yes, it's fine to offer small written fragments that offer some small snippet of lore. Going back to our example earlier, we have this eldritch grimoire that was used to call the Black Curse. Well, if your players are exploring a Tankari ruin, remember that they were defeated by the curse, so they aren't likely to have any written record of their own demise. So maybe a member of one of the conspirators went to Tankari after its fall to check on their handiwork. It's possible they left an artifact indicating their own doing. It could be as unsubtle as some documentation about their curse weaving, or it could be something a little bit more subtle, maybe like an arcane amulet that was used to synchronize the channeling of the curse across all these different magic users. If the party studies the amulet, they could find the curse imprinted on it, and maybe they could find a way to reverse engineer it to use it against their own enemies that they find in their adventuring. Another way to show our world's history is to have these moments preserved in time. This gives your players a micro diorama of context for the place that they are exploring. They can see pieces of the events that took place in the dungeon, and they can use those as clues to try to surmise what happened in the past. Going back to our Black Curse example, there are some ways we could show it within our dungeons. Maybe the commoners that perished in the curse left a black silhouette where they were destroyed. Now, as the players are exploring the dungeon, they see these black silhouettes dotted all across the location, and they start to kind of wonder what happened here. Or maybe the sorcerers of Tankari were able to put up some arcane defenses to save themselves from total destruction. This great clashing of magic from the curse and their own powers sort of left this arcane remnant at the scenes of the crime. And the players can see this sort of recurring ghostly theater of these sorcerers trying to fight off the curse, but ultimately becoming these twisted monstrosities. That way you kind of have this like holographic video on repeat that your players can see this sort of moment captured in time. And your players have this understanding of these arcane monstrosities that they've encountered in the dungeon. The fragments are enough to give your players the context for the dungeons they're exploring, but leave enough mystery for them to ask further questions. The questions they key in on are the ones you're going to want to build out further as you continue to work on your campaign. If you're short on time for prepping your campaign, this flexible lore approach really is a good method in my opinion. You can create these compelling histories just by highlighting pieces of a greater working, and you can organically build out what you need if and when your players take interest in learning more about it. And you aren't spending your time making histories that don't actually come into play at the table. Again, nothing wrong if you enjoy the world building aspect of it and like writing pages of information for your histories, but you will want to distill down the key elements that will drive action for your players. If you enjoyed the video, please give it a like. It really does help the channel out a lot. Consider subscribing to my newsletter, Enchanted Nimbus. Thanks for hopping aboard the Earthmote. I'll see you in the next one.